I wish I could say I did not have a personal stake in this video, because unfortunately, Panic at the Disco is a very personal subject for me. As lame as it sounds in the present day, that band fundamentally changed my life. I remember when I first heard them. I was in elementary school when I Write Sins Not Tragedies came on the radio, and my dad always really liked it. And I remember in the 6th grade when I got an iPod Touch, I was able to check out the album that the song had come from, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, and let me tell you, I was hooked. To this day, it's probably still my favorite album of all time, and I'd argue one of the most impressive debut albums for any band in the 2000s. From there, I went all of the natural places that a person in my demographic could go. Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, Warped Tour, Hot Topic, Chunky Bracelets, Tumblr. That was all my vibe for a long time, probably too long of a time. And looking back, I of course find the majority of it to be incredibly goddamn cringe, but nonetheless, it was a trajectory that would not have happened had I not discovered this band. Because I was so young when I discovered Panic, I didn't see them live in concert until the Vices and Virtues era. I saw them in Central Park in 2011. Pete Wentz was there, but not with Fall Out Boy. It was weird. Since then, I've seen them several more times, and each time the band had different members on stage. Like how the Wiggles had a different Yellow Wiggle for a while, and then they went back to the original Yellow Wiggle, and then the Wiggles all became different. It was like that, but everyone had bad haircuts and it was still commonplace to describe them as metrosexual. As we'll get into, Panic at the Disco has taken on a lot of different iterations over the years. It started as one thing and became something completely different. But at the center of it all is one man. One man who went from an emo heartthrob to a Vine star, to a quirky Broadway lead with a Taylor Swift song credit under his belt, to the internet's punching bag. And unfortunately, there is no person more qualified to talk about this chaos arc than me. And for those of you who are just as deep in the Panic at the Disco lore as I am, and you want to know just how qualified I am for a video like this, well... One more quick thing before we jump into it, please follow me on Twitter because my old account got suspended, or Blue Sky if you have an invite, or Threads, which is the same as my Instagram. I'm hoping that one of these emerges as the potential victor in all of this because I'm so tired of having to keep track of 3 apps, and whichever one does win, I'll stick with that one, and then I can direct you all there. In the meantime, I'm gonna keep doing this annoying carousel when I direct you to all of them, depending on what you have, and I'm eventually gonna get around to making a link tree so this can all just be in one place. Anyway.
Hey, we're Panic at the Disco. Welcome to AOL Music Session.
Panic at the Disco was an American pop rock band from Las Vegas, Nevada, formed in 2004 by childhood friends Ryan Ross, Spencer Smith, Brent Wilson, who was later replaced by bassist John Walker, and of course, Brendon Urie. They released their debut album, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, back in 2005, and I talked about it a little bit, but it's a certified pop-punk classic. Of course, there's I Write Sins, which is the song that everyone knows, but the whole album is really quirky and also full of this raw, guttural emotion. It has this fun little circus freak show theme and has the best components of their own unique sound and, like, divine inspiration from Fall Out Boy. It put the band on the map rather quickly. After the success of Fever, we only got one more album with this core 4. Their sophomore album was called Pretty Odd, and it definitely lives up to its title. As far of a departure from A Fever You Can't Sweat Out as you can possibly get. It's very cerebral, it's very heavily inspired by the music of the 60s, it sort of has a Beatles or Beach Boys tone in particular, and it's definitely beloved by a lot of Panic fans, but not exactly by the band itself. The album only had one big commercially viable hit, which is 9 in the Afternoon, which I believe is also the first song of theirs that was featured on Guitar Hero or Rock Band, which led to this awkward interview if I'm not mistaken.
I hate every song on Guitar Hero now.
Oh, that's weird, because we covered one on Guitar Hero. So,
Yeah, well,
that's cool.
I hate it.
Liar.
Yeah, it's kind of a sensitive subject now.
Hey, yeah, I'm just kidding.
There's just been problems.
Anyway, Pretty Odd became a literal diverging point for the 4 members of the band. The band's guitarist and lyricist Ryan Ross and bassist John Walker wanted to go in this direction for their sound permanently, whereas drummer Spencer Smith and Brendon Urie didn't necessarily want to go back to their pop-punk roots with Fever, but rather wanted to find a different way to progress their sound forward, and so the band split. Ryan and John formed a side project called The Young Vanes, and Brendon and Spencer kept the Panic at the Disco moniker for their third album. Vices and Virtues was Panic's first venture as a duo. Spencer and Brendon headed up the project and recruited guitarist Ian Crawford and bassist Dallin Weeks for live touring performances. Vices is good. It definitely tries to build on the vibe of Fever, but instead of a circus freak show vibe, I get more of noir meets steampunk. There's songs I really love on it, like Let's Kill Tonight, Hurricane, Always, and Nearly Witches, and songs I'm not as big a fan of, like Trade Mistakes or The Calendar. Overall, though, it's a solid album, I like it, and most Panic fans like it. The tour for Vices and Virtues ended in 2012, and Brendon, Spencer, and Dallin recorded the band's fourth studio album, Too Weird to Live, Too Rare to Die. But shortly after the project's recording, Spencer left the band due to health issues, leaving Brendon and Dallin as the only remaining members. And this is where the train starts to fall off the tracks just a little bit. While the trio recorded the project together, this was the first time the marketing and overall concept was very Brendon-centric, which is evident by the album art where he is the only one present.
This is gospel for the fallen ones, locked away in permanent slumber, assembling their philosophies from pieces of broken memories.
I like most of this album, although I feel like parts of it are a little unfocused, and it definitely marks a transition in terms of their sound where electronic production is more of the dominant aesthetic here, and it's probably some of their most commercially viable music up until this point in time. Which is fine, all bands go through changes, this seemed like a natural progression of things for the most part. The band had also gone through many transitions with its actual members, that for the first time there were a couple of mumbles of like, why doesn't Brendon Urie just go solo, although that criticism didn't really pick up until a little later on. It's also worth noting that around this time, Brendon himself was rather beloved and adored by fans, some of which weren't all that familiar with the older days of Panic. Many people became aware of him for two reasons during this particular stretch of his career. One, because This Is Gospel became a really big hit, it's a song I really love and most people tend to really enjoy, and it had two pretty viral music videos which, added to its reach. The other was because Brendon Urie, like a lot of celebrities at this point around 2013, ended up joining Vine. Vine was an app where you could share 6-second videos. It was around when I was in high school and then it died, but at the time it was a rather influential tool for celebrities as they could use it to post silly downtime videos. And Brendon seemed to always be pretty charming and goofy, and his videos got a lot of hits.
Yo, it's just me and my Jack Russell Terrier. Got a good flow and we breaking down barriers. Doesn't do much, but sit back and share it. You're taking good care of your Jack Russell Terrier.
A lot of Brendon's good fortune then carried into the band's next album, Death of a Bachelor, but by this point there was definitely quite a bit of speculation as to when Brendon Urie would drop the delusion that he was still in a band, especially because it seemed pretty definite that Spencer wasn't going to return, plus Dallin reverted to being just a touring member rather than a more prominent creative force actually making the music. My biggest guess as to why Death of a Bachelor wasn't a solo project was because Panic at the Disco had gone through so many changes in terms of members, aesthetic, and style that it didn't necessarily matter who was in the band. For all intents and purpose, every album so far was made by a slightly different band anyway. And going solo is a big career move. Maybe he just thought it would be a more profitable venture to stick with the same name and branding, and despite all odds, it kind of worked, because Death of a Bachelor is a pretty solid album. Certainly better than Too Weird to Live, Too Rare to Die in my opinion, and probably the last of Panic's albums that are definitely good. Sure, some of it is a little corny, some of it doesn't sound like old Panic, whatever that means, but all of that melts away when you consider the sheer magnitude of how much the song LA Devotee fucks. And while Panic keeps chugging out albums with various levels of identity crises, Brendon himself is becoming a bigger and bigger star. He performed at the Kennedy Center Honors for Billy Joel. He wrote music for SpongeBob the Musical. In 2017, it was announced that he would star in Cyndi Lauper's Tony Award-winning Broadway musical Kinky Boots, where he played one of the lead roles, Charlie Price. And in 2019, he was featured on Taylor Swift's Worst Song. Brendon Urie was all of a sudden a pretty palatable and successful star himself, with a solo act masquerading as a band. And despite all potential inclination not to do so, he continued performing as Panic at the Disco through the later part of the decade. And I guess he had no reason to not continue doing this, because it hadn't harmed him in any way commercially. He was putting out music and people were still listening to it, and he had a number of side projects that he could go back to if he ever got bored. But in the music industry, all it takes is one slip-up. One critical misstep that gives everyone an excuse to label you as cringe and say they had a bad feeling about you all along. And for Brendon Urie, the worst was yet to come. I can't play the actual song for copyright because of the fucking dipshits at YouTube, but you know how it goes. It's like, had to have high hopes for a living. That bullshit, yeah, that song, that's what I'm talking about. I wish I could play it for you, but I fucking can't. Okay, let's back up a teeny bit here. In 2018, Panic at the Disco released an album called Pray for the Wicked. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think I've ever gotten fully through this album. I didn't like what I heard of it very much, but one of the songs in that project, called High Hopes, got picked up by the campaign of then presidential hopeful Pete Buttigieg, the least cool presidential candidate that could possibly pick up your song. And on top of that, they created an incredibly cringy dance for his staffers to perform while on the campaign trail. Oh no, it's the next day and my outfit continuity is ruined. Anyway, I want to tell a quick story about my personal experience with this song, because in 2020, I was in college, I was in my senior year, and I went to journalism school. And for my capstone, I got to produce a 30-minute special on the Iowa caucus that year. So me and Brian and a bunch of other college students headed out to Iowa to cover the election event. So I attended quite a few Pete Buttigieg rallies in which I heard this song, I saw the staffers do the dance. Okay, whatever, a little cringe, but we move on, we got bigger fish to fry. Fast forward to the night of the Iowa caucus election, and I don't know if anybody remembers this, because a lot happened right after it, but the Iowa caucus basically didn't happen because they had used this new app to report the results, and it didn't work, and everything was broken, and the Pete Buttigieg campaign basically prematurely took credit for a victory, even though the results had been super inconclusive, because people were like, did Bernie win? Did Pete win? And basically, that resulted in me and a couple other college kids having to huff it in a car to the Pete Buttigieg campaign headquarters, where he was going to come out and do this victory speech, where we weren't at because we didn't think he was going to win, and we had to basically break into the Pete Buttigieg gym where this victory party was being held. I was so stressed. We didn't get a conclusive result the whole night. I was crying. I had to rewrite my whole show. It was a disaster. And that night, I heard High Hopes so many goddamn times, waiting for this man to come out on stage and take credit for an election that he probably did not win. So I'm okay if I never hear High Hopes ever again for as long as I live. Anyway, this was in a lot of ways the beginning of the end for Brendon, even though he didn't really do anything in this case. But the virality of High Hopes really put a spotlight on what the most hardcore Panic fans have known for a long time. This is not a band anymore. This was Brendon Urie putting out mediocre, cookie-cutter, elevator music, so generic that a Democratic presidential candidate can find a way to make it even less cool, a feat so dramatic when you consider that this is what their music used to sound like. Okay, so High Hopes was harmless if a little cringe, but this isn't the most serious situation that has happened in Brendon Urie's ongoing fall from grace. In 2020, once High Hopes Gate had kind of dissipated, Breezy Weeks, wife of former Panic at the Disco bass player Dallin Weeks, accused the band's bodyguard Zach Hall of sexual harassment. Following this revelation, a number of users on Twitter began to accuse Brendon himself of a similar kind of harassment, although it's worth noting that a number of these accusations were made in tweets that have since been deleted. Around this time, a clip also surfaced of Brendon giving some questionable stage banter, and definitely in the earlier times that I've seen Panic live, this was pretty much par for the course in every show.
We leave you with this thought. If I see you after the show, I'm gonna fuck you. And I don't care if you want it. I more care if you don't want it. Because then I really want it. Dude. I really want it, bro.
In another controversial moment, Urie made a comment saying, quote, "I wish I was born black so I could wear the clothes that I wear without getting made fun of." He is also seen mouthing the N-word in an old Vine. He also reportedly said a transphobic slur, which he later apologized for. Brendon also eventually did fire the security guard that was accused of this harassment, but it seems that Dallin Weekes still harbors some hard feelings, changing the caption of an old photo on Instagram of his hand after an airsoft injury to #TBT when I got shot with an airsoft gun on stage in the middle of playing a song, and I had to pretend it was funny so that I could keep my job. Brendon had initially commented on that same photo when it was posted, saying, "Got you good." Got him good, you did, Brendon. Got him good, you did. So Brendon is the closest to cancellation that he has ever gotten, but the story doesn't end there. Still under the name Panic at the Disco for some godforsaken reason, he releases the band's final album for now, Viva Las Vengeance. Now, this is also an album that I haven't been able to bring myself to listen to all the way through, mostly because it's bad, but also as a hardcore former Panic fan in their glory days, it just makes me really depressed. But the thing is that up until this point, no one ever contested that Brendon Urie could sing. He is vocally very talented. But with the release of Viva Las Vengeance and the corresponding tour dates, it became clear that in some way or another, Brendon Urie has been straining his voice to the point where in some situations, it actually sounds unrecognizable. There are hundreds of clips like this floating around on the internet right now, and I'm not a professionally trained singer, but I've listened to videos of professionally trained singers explaining what's going wrong here, and basically, he's straining the shit out of his voice to the point that it's causing actual damage to his vocal cords, and if you listen to a lot of his more recent live performances, it just sounds really awful, which is so almost uncanny valley because his voice up until this point has been very good. It's just kind of sad to see. So basically, all of Viva Las Vengeance got panned by critics, and it was clear that Brendon needed a break. I mean, he pretty much did a tour for every single Panic album that has been released, and that can obviously get very, draining in a lot of ways, both mentally and on your voice. Brendon went kind of quiet after all of these allegations came to light, and also the poor reception to Viva Las Vengeance, and then in January of 2023, he posted on Instagram that the emo pop band that began in 2004, Panic at the Disco, was ending its run after 7 albums and nearly 2 decades of making music. In this same Instagram post, he also announced that his wife Sarah was pregnant with their first child, and that he was going to basically put the chapter of his life of Panic at the Disco to an end to focus his energy on his family. And when this announcement came out, I weirdly enough didn't feel anything, which is interesting considering that this band has meant a lot to me over the years, but by the time this announcement came around, it didn't feel like it was the same band at all. I mean, obviously it wasn't. The only constant throughout these 2 decades was Brendon, which is impressive in its own right, but at the same time, I can't help but feel like something that started out really special became washed out and corporate and broken and tainted, just like everything else. And I'm kind of tired of that happening. I hate when a good thing exists and everyone enjoys it and derives some kind of really important meaning out of it for themselves, and then it just gets ruined by external forces of evil or capitalism or whatever. It just kind of sucks. Ultimately, I am still grateful for Panic at the Disco's existence. I hold Fever as an album in my heart quite fondly, and I probably always will. I hope Ryan Ross is doing well, and I hope most of all that now you understand why the internet fell out of love with Brendon Urie. See what I did there? I said the thing. I said the thing. That's all for me, you guys, and I'll see you next time.